about this plan than actual preparation, and the doctor thought it would never be carried out, but Pamphil's spirits fell and his hallucinations came back. 4. Before winter finally set in, the camp went through a period of disturbances, anxieties, uncertainties, confused, threatening situations, and a number of weird incidents. The whites had completed the encirclement according to plan. They were headed by Generals Vitzen, Quadri, and Basiligo, who were known far and wide for their harshness and unyielding resolution, and whose names alone terrified the refugees inside the camp as well as the peaceful population remaining in its native villages at the rear of the encircling troops. As we have said, the enemy had no means of tightening his grip, so the partisans had no reason to worry on this account. On the other hand, it was impossible for them to remain inactive. They realized that passive acceptance of their plight would strengthen enemy morale. However safe they were inside their trap, they had to attempt a sortie, even if only as a military demonstration. A strong force was set aside for this purpose and concentrated against the western arc of the circle. After several days fighting, the partisans defeated the whites and broke through to their rear. This breach opened a way to the camp in the taiga, and through it poured a stream of new refugees. Not all of these were related to the partisans. Terrified by the punitive measures of the whites, all the peasants of the surrounding countryside had fled from their homes and now sought to join the partisans, whom they regarded as their natural protectors. But the camp, anxious to get rid of its own dependents, had no place for newcomers and strangers. Men were sent to meet the fugitives and to divert them to a village on the river Chilimka. The village was called Dvori, farms, because of the farmsteads that had grown up around its mill. There it was proposed to settle the refugees for the winter and to send the supplies that were allotted to them. While these steps were being taken, however, events followed their own course and the camp command could not always cope with them. The enemy had closed the breach in his positions and the partisan unit that had broken through was now unable to get back into the taiga. Also, the women refugees were getting out of hand. It was easy to lose one's way in the taiga. The men sent out to turn back the refugees often missed them, and the women flooded into the forest, chopping down trees, building roads and bridges, and achieving prodigies of resourcefulness. All this was counter to the intentions of the partisan command, working havoc with the plan made by Liberius. 5. That was why he was in such a temper as he stood talking to the trapper, Svirid, near the highway, which came close to the edge of the taiga at this point. Several of his officers stood on the highway, arguing about whether to cut the telegraph line that ran along the road. Liberius would have the final word, but he was deep in conversation with the trapper and kept signaling to the others to wait for him. Svirid had been deeply shocked by the shooting of Vdovichenko, whose only crime had been that his influence rivaled that of Liberius and brought dissension into the camp. Svirid wished he could leave the partisans and go back to his old, private, independent life. But this was out of the question. He had made his choice, and were he to leave his forest brothers now he would be executed as a deserter. The weather was the worst imaginable. A sharp, scudding wind swept torn, low clouds as black as flying soot before it. Snow would suddenly fall from them with a convulsive, insane haste. In a moment the broad expanse of the earth was covered with a white blanket. The next minute, the white blanket was consumed, melted completely, and the earth emerged as black as coal under the black sky splashed with slanting streaks at distant showers. The earth could not absorb any more water. Then the clouds would part like windows, as though to air the sky, which shimmered with a cold, glassy white brilliance. The stagnant, unabsorbed water on the ground responded by opening the windows of its pools and puddles, shimmering with the same brilliance. The vapors skidded like smoke over the pine woods. Their resinous needles were as waterproof as oilcloth. Raindrops were strung on the telegraph wires like beads one next to the other without ever falling. Svirid was one of those who had been sent to meet the women refugees. He wanted to tell his chief about the things he had seen, about the confusion resulting from conflicting orders, none of which could be carried out, and about the atrocities committed by the weakest elements of the female hordes, the first to succumb to despair. Trudging on foot, loaded with sacks, bundles, and babies, young mothers who had lost their milk, driven out of their minds by the horrors of the journey, abandoned their children, shook the corn out of their sacks onto the ground, and turned back. A quick death, they had decided, was preferable to a slow death by starvation. Better to fall into the clutches of the enemy than to be torn to pieces by some beast in the forest. Other women, the strongest, were models of courage and self-control, unsurpassed by men. Svirid had many other things to tell his chief. He wanted to warn him of an impending new rebellion, more dangerous than the one that had been put down, but Liberius, by hurrying him, deprived him of the power of speech. Liberius kept interrupting Svirid not only because his friends were calling and waving to him from the highway, but because during the past 2 weeks he had been given similar warnings time and again, and by now he knew them by heart. "Give me time, comrade chief. I am no good at finding words. They stick in my throat, they choke me. What I say is this: go to the refugee camp and tell those women to stop their nonsense. Otherwise, I ask you, what is this supposed to be, all against Kolchak? Or a civil war among the women? Get on with it, Svirid. You see I'm wanted. Don't spin it out. And now there's that she-devil, Zaludarika. God only knows what she is. She says, put me down as a woman ventilator to look after the cattle. Veterinary, you mean? That's what I say, a woman ventilator to cure cattle of wind. But she's not looking after cattle now, such a heretic, devil's reverend mother she has turned out to be. She says cows are masses, and turns young refugee wives from their duty. You've only yourselves to blame for your miseries, she says to them. That's what comes of hitching up your skirts and running after the red flag. Don't do it again. What refugees are you talking about? Ours, from the camp, or some other kind? The others, of course. The new ones, the strangers. But they had orders to go to Dvori. How have they got here? Dvori. That's a good one. Your Dvori's burned out, mill and all, nothing left of it but cinders. That's what they saw when they came by, not a living thing. Half of them went crazy, yelled and howled and turned straight back to the whites, and the other half turned this way. But how do they get through the taiga, through the swamps? What are saws and axes for? Some of our men, who were sent to guard them, helped them a bit. 20 miles of road they've cut, they say. Bridges and all, the brutes. Talk about women. They've done things that would take us a month of Sundays. That's a fine thing, 20 miles of road. And what are you looking so pleased about, you jackass? That's just what the whites want, a highway into the taiga. Now all they have to do is to roll in their artillery. Send a force to guard the road. I can do my own thinking, thank you. 6. The days were getting shorter. It was dark by 5. Toward dusk Yurii Andreyevich crossed the highway at the very place where Liberius had stood talking to Svirid a few days earlier. He was on his way back to the camp. Near the clearing where the mound and the rowan tree marked the camp boundary, he heard the bold, challenging voice of Kubaraka, his rival as he jokingly called the cattle healer. She was singing a gay jingle and her voice had a raucous, boisterous screech in it. Judging by the peals of approving laughter that kept interrupting her, there was a crowd of men and women listening. Then came silence. The people must have dispersed. Thinking herself alone, Kubaraka sang a different song, softly, as if to herself. Yurii Andreyevich, who was cautiously making his way in the dusk along the footpath that skirted the swamp in front of the Rowan Tree, stopped in his tracks. Kubaraka was singing an old Russian song, but he did not know it. Or she was improvising it? An old Russian folk song is like water held back by a dam. It looks as if it were still and were no longer flowing, but in its depths it is ceaselessly rushing through the sluice gates and the stillness of its surface is deceptive. By every possible means, by repetitions and similes, the song slows down the gradual unfolding of its theme. Then at some point it suddenly reveals itself and astounds us. That is how the song's sorrowing spirit comes to expression. The song is an insane attempt to stop time by means of its words. Kubaraka half sang and half recited. As a hare was running about the wide world, over the white snow. He ran, the lop-eared hare, past a rowan tree, and complained to it. "Have I not," he said, a timorous heart, so faint and weak?" "I am frightened," he said, "of the wild beast's tracks, the wolf's hungry belly. Pity me, O rowan bush! O fair rowan tree! Do not give thy beauty to the wicked enemy, the wicked raven. Scatter thy red berries to the wind, over the wide world, over the white snow. Fling them, roll them to my native town, to the far end of the street, the last house in the street, the last window, the room where she has shut herself in. My beloved, my longed for love. Whisper to my grieving love, my bride, a warm, an ardent word. I, a soldier, languish in captivity. Homesick, I am, poor soldier, kept in foreign parts. I'll break from durance bitter. I'll go to my red berry, to my lovely bride." 7. Agafia Fotievna, Pamphil's wife, had brought her sick cow to Kubaraka. The cow had been separated from the herd and tethered to a tree by a rope tied to her horns. Her mistress sat on a tree stump by the cow's forelegs and Kubaraka, on a milking stool, by her hind legs. The rest of the countless herd was crammed into a glade. Hemmed in all around by the dark forest of triangular firs, as tall as hills and rising from their spreading lower branches as if they were squatting on fat bottoms on the ground. The cows were mostly black with white spots and belonged to some Swiss breed popular in Siberia. They were exhausted, no less exhausted than their owners by privations, endless wandering, and intolerable crowding. Rubbing flank to flank and maddened by the lack of space, they forgot their sex and reared and climbed on top of one another, pulling up their heavy udders with an effort and roaring like bulls. The heifers who were covered by them broke away from underneath and rushed off into the forest, tails in the air and trampling shrubs and branches. Their herdsmen, old men and children, ran shrieking after them. And as if they too were hemmed in by the tight circle of treetops in the winter sky above the glade, the black and white clouds reared and piled and toppled as chaotically as the cows. The knot of curious onlookers who stood at a distance annoyed the witch, and she measured them from top to toe with a hostile look. But, vain as an artist, she felt that it was beneath her dignity to admit that they embarrassed her. She pretended not to notice them. The doctor watched her from the back of the crowd, where she could not see him. This was the first time he took a good look at her. She wore her usual English cap and pea-green overcoat with its crumpled collar. But the haughty and passionate expression that gave a youthful fire and darkness to this aging woman's eyes showed plainly that she did not care in the least what she was wearing or not wearing. What astonished Yurii Andreevich was the change in Pamphil's wife. He could scarcely recognize her. In the last few days she had aged terribly. Her goggling eyes were almost ready to pop out of their sockets and her neck was as thin and long as a cart shaft. Such was the effect upon her of her secret fears. "She doesn't give any milk, my dear," she was saying. "I thought she might be in calf, but then she would have had milk by now and she still hasn't any."